Good morning. As of this morning, he's been in office for less than a week, and already President Donald Trump has made some big moves. We're talking about the start of his presidency with presidential historian Dr. Thomas Balcerski, a professor at Eastern Connecticut State University. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We said we'd have you back because we knew big things were going to be happening. Well,
Yes.
We're less than a week in to President Trump's second term. What are your thoughts from a historical perspective just on what we've seen over the last almost 7 days?
Well, the name of the game has been executive orders. Donald Trump issued more executive orders on his first day in office than any president before him. And the public and the rest of us are just catching up to even understand what they all meant. Some of them were routine. Some of them were the transition of various office holders from one administration to the next. But there's been a number that have stood out that have already roiled politics here in Connecticut and around the nation. These executive orders are typically done in the Oval Office, but not Donald Trump. He signed them at the Capitol, and he also signed them at the actual Verizon Center in Washington, D.C. in a very public display that was more or less a campaign rally. So Donald Trump is again changing the nature and the use of executive orders from his first day.
One thing he famously said, you talked about campaign rallies, at a campaign rally was people said he was going to be a dictator, and he said, I'm not going to be a dictator except for the first day. Yeah. We saw a lot of movement on the first day. What did you make of those moves? And you know, some things like birthright citizenship being removed by executive order, a lot of people say that's settled law constitutionally. What, from a historical perspective, what do we watch for now from that perspective?
Well, executive orders are very nebulous, and historically presidents have used them almost sometimes to project power over Congress or the courts. In this case, I think Trump has to understand, and I'm sure he knows, that this order on birthright citizenship will be challenged and already has been by the Attorney General here in Connecticut and by many Attorney Generals across the United States. This one probably will be before a judge for an injunction hearing this week, and from there it will very quickly escalate to the Supreme Court. The 14th Amendment is the stated law under consideration here. That's an amendment that goes back to the 1860s, and that's also very interesting because in that context, President Andrew Johnson was facing an embattled situation where the Congress was trying to overturn much of what he did in his presidential reconstruction. And this time we have a much more friendly Congress and a much more friendly Supreme Court. So the stakes are different. There really is a very unique setup here whereby Trump's orders may be upheld in some way, in some limited way, and may be challenged in a different way. And I wouldn't be surprised if this one goes to the courts for years to come.
One thing that we for sure saw was the peaceful transfer of power.
Yes.
And we saw, you know, notably past presidents, past first ladies who ran to be president, the vice president, outgoing vice president who ran to be president, all sitting there behind Donald Trump or in the presence of Donald Trump. Is there a historical takeaway from that as well?
Well, first of all, I think for all of us, it was great to see another inauguration day in which the current president, the incoming president, the outgoing president, past presidents, past first ladies were all on the same stage. It was unique in that it was indoor. We hadn't seen that since Ronald Reagan's second inauguration in 1985. But that maybe changed the dynamic of both of the feeling of the day and ultimately how the speech that Donald Trump gave, his inaugural address, which was twice the length of his first inaugural address, felt to those of us watching at home. Donald Trump in that moment gave more of a campaign rally, a polished one at that, off a teleprompter. But it felt different than inaugural addresses in the past. That being said, there was the peaceful transfer of power, and for outgoing President Joe Biden, that was a commitment he made. We also learned that the outgoing president, President Biden, left a note for Trump, which was just released this past week. So it was a gracious note. He wished Donald Trump success, and really that he would draw on the strength of the American people and the White House itself and its long history for the presidency going forward. So on the one hand, everyone showed up, everyone did their part. On the other, Donald Trump's presence, his speech, and then his subsequent remarks at the Capitol lunch were very different and struck a different tone than past presidential inaugurations.
One thing that struck me listening to some Trump supporters and very strong Trump supporters was they seemed to accept the fact that in many times he speaks with hyperbole. Right. And we saw that in some of his proposals, changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico, perhaps buying Greenland, maybe Canada could become a 51st state. As you, as a presidential historian, look at some of those bombastic type promises or pledges or ideas, how does that, are there past cases of presidents saying wild, outrageous stuff, which they may or may not mean?
Well, we know that Donald Trump tends to say a lot of things, and only some of them are more immediately followed up. But I think that in this case, some of these more outlandish claims, these bombastic claims, are actually distractions, perhaps, for what the American people need to focus on, which are these executive orders, which are much more powerful and much more immediate. As far as his legislative agenda, that will depend a lot on the Congress, and there will be no treaty for Greenland, excuse me, unless the Congress is on board. So a lot will come out during this first session of Congress. The more immediate battle, too, is his cabinet appointments. And he is facing an uphill battle in numerous of those appointments, including the Secretary of Defense, possibly Health and Human Services, and or his national security advisor. So in a way, I think it's part of the same playbook he's used from his campaign onward, which is to say a lot, see what sticks, and try to distract from other parts of his agenda.
There are things that he could do and has threatened to do, like maybe adjourning the Congress and doing recess appointments. When you see some of those tactics, is that something when you're looking at it from a historical perspective that you're going to make a check mark and say something happened here that doesn't happen a lot? No,
it's true. Recess appointments have actually disappeared, since it seems like the Republican Senate is actually unified more or less around the majority of his appointments. Marco Rubio went through 99-0 for Secretary of State, which is actually not uncommon, especially for a sitting senator to get the full support of the Senate. But it's going to be some of these more controversial picks that may end up being done through recess appointments or in having to be replaced with a different appointee. I think the recess appointment is particularly interesting because George H.W. Bush was the first to try it and to succeed with it. But the courts actually commented that there was a lot of concern this could become a regular part of the presidential appointment process. And even conservative justices were concerned about it. So again, the courts have usually not weighed in on this process, but it could be that a challenge is even made here that has to get adjudicated, since it would be unprecedented to have multiple appointments done through recess.
We only have about 30 seconds left, but I just want to ask you what you'll be watching for going forward. I think a lot of people will be watching the news, and it certainly has been coming at us like a fire hose. But as someone who studies the history of the presidency, what will you be watching for?
Well, these are Donald Trump's first 100 days in office. The most significant legislation, the most significant policy tends to happen right now. So we do need to pay attention, especially for those first 100 days. And I want to see how Donald Trump positions his agenda to the American people. I want to see if his tone changes or moderates. I want to see if the office essentially gives the man a new perspective. So we'll be watching carefully his public addresses coming up, his first address to Congress, and how he works with congressional leaders in the coming days.
Well, it's one thing that has been almost unanimously said is he certainly has a team around him this time that is used to being in the White House and used to dealing with Congress, which maybe he didn't have the luxury of the first time. So these first 100 days will certainly be interesting. We appreciate you coming back, and as I said last time, we're going to have you back again because there's a lot to talk about on this topic. Thomas Balcerski, thanks for being with us.